Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we'll be discussing the Age of Exploration, and that's a term I frankly don't love, mainly because it leaves out some of the other major exploration that had already been taking place. For instance, in the 1420s with Zheng He and the Chinese, or voyages of the Polynesians. So we're going to refer to this instead in the more specific, historically accurate, non-Eurocentric way as the Age of European Exploration. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: why did European states sponsor exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries? And why 1492 and why Western Europe? The first big question we should be able to answer: why did European states sponsor exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries?
Our story of how Europe made it to the New World first really begins in the 11th century with the Crusades, those attempts to recapture by Christians the Holy Land. And as a result of the Crusades, Europeans, although they ultimately aren't successful, Europeans return back to Europe and they have this newfound desire and demand for products from Asia. And for Europe to be able to get those products, they had to go along the Silk Road. You may recall also in 1295, Marco Polo actually was able to successfully make this journey across the Silk Road and spent time with Kublai Khan and the Mongols as they ruled China. Well, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire is going to capture Constantinople, what was left of the Byzantine Empire. And this is going to limit overland trade between Europe and Asia because there are going to be these Muslim middlemen who are going to impose higher taxes in terms of their ability to get goods from South Asia and East Asia. And Europeans, therefore, want to find a water route to Asia to avoid the dangers of the Silk Road and these Muslim traders. To Europe, here's what the map of the world looked like in 1482. So they had a good sense of Europe and a good sense of Asia, but they didn't really understand Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa. The Portuguese, beginning in the 1400s, began exploration along the west coast of Africa. This really begins under Prince Henry the Navigator. He's also going to set up a maritime college in Portugal that is going to essentially train mariners and further Europe's understanding of maritime technology. In 1488, the Portuguese first make their way all the way down to the tip of sub-Saharan Africa under the exploration of Bartholomew Diaz, but he's going to ultimately return back. And then in 1498, Vasco da Gama is going to complete this journey and is going to lead the Portuguese into the Indian Ocean for the first time. And he's going to be the first to sail to India and to establish a network of direct trade connections between Europe and India. And so the Portuguese are then going to become these dominant players within the Indian Ocean sea lanes very quickly. That's the situation that we find ourselves in when Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator from Genoa, is going to meet with the King and Queen of Spain, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, and he's going to convince them that he can reach the east, so he can reach East Asia by sailing west into the Atlantic Ocean. And many people at the time, the advisors to the King and Queen of Spain, believed that Columbus was nuts. And it wasn't because that they believed that the earth was flat and Columbus was the only one who understood that the earth was in fact round. That is this myth that's perpetuated about world history. In actuality, most of the advisors understood that the earth was much larger than the size that Columbus believed it to be. So Columbus was badly mistaken about the size of the earth, and most people, dating all the way back to the ancient Greeks, the Indians, had a pretty good sense of the relative size of the earth. But despite this, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella are going to sponsor Columbus's journey, mainly because they wanted to compete with their rival, the Portuguese. And so they agree to pay for Columbus's voyages. So Columbus sets sail from Portugal. And eventually, his goal was to reach China, East Asia. About 3,700 miles into his journey, though, he runs into San Salvador, an island in the Caribbean. And he was only about 7,500 miles away. And it's just simply science. Columbus badly miscalculated the size of the Earth. But Columbus would then return, and he would make 4 journeys in total. See the routes of those voyages. And you can see that is spending the predominant amount of his time down here in the Caribbean. He spends a little time in Central America and South America. Those are the Spanish sponsorship of Columbus's voyages, starting in 1492, is going to increase European interest in transoceanic travel and trade. And so this is going to be this critical turning point date in world history because it's going to lead to lasting and sustained contact between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. So the Spanish are going to continue their exploration under a navigator named Ferdinand Magellan. And their goal is really to figure out a route East Asia. And so they're going to send Magellan on a voyage. And Magellan is going to navigate around South America. And that's why this region down here is known as the Straits of Magellan. He and his crew of about 200 sailors are going to sail out into the Pacific Ocean. Eventually, they are going to make their way to the Philippines, and they badly miscalculated also the size of the Pacific Ocean, and so they had very few supplies by the time they reached the Philippines, and many of the sailors of Magellan's ship had died by that point. While he's in the Philippines, Ferdinand Magellan himself is going to die as a result of a fight between himself and local Filipinos. What's left of his crew is eventually going to make their way back into the one boat that they have remaining and sail around into the Indian Ocean, across and around Africa, and make their way back to Spain. So in 1521, the crew of the Spanish explorer Ferdinand Magellan becomes the first to circumnavigate the Earth, to sail all the way around the Earth. So Magellan, again, is going to die in the Philippines. And this is going to be important, though, because this is going to be a region that Spain is going to colonized starting in 1565. And so the Philippines becomes one of the very first colonies in Asia. And when it comes to Southeast Asia, the country today that is overwhelmingly Christian is the Philippines as a result of early Spanish colonization and missionary work in the Philippines.
So let's turn to the second question. Why 1492 and why Western Europe? Why was there sustained and lasting contact? Why not China in the 1400s? Why not the Islamic world in the 11th century? Why not the Vikings in the 11th century when they reached the New World successfully? Europe benefited from a number of advancements in maritime technology, some of which were developed in Europe in the Classical Age. We talked about the astrolabe being developed by the Greeks. There were a number of advancements made in the Islamic world. There were a number of advancements made in the Asian world. And a lot of these ideas have been flowing to Europe by way of the Silk Road, by way of the Indian Ocean sea lanes. We see here just a vast difference in maritime technology that existed in the 15th century between, this is the boats that Christopher Columbus reached the Americas on. He had 3 of these boats. These are the Chinese junk boats that were sailed by Zheng He, and they had nearly 300 of these ships. And so certainly there was a discrepancy in terms of maritime technology as we entered the 1400s. A number of these technologies were making their way to Europe by the time we get to 1492. So we have the maritime compass, first developed by the Chinese. We have the astrolabe, first developed by the Greeks and then improved upon by the Islamic world. We have these triangular lateen sails developed in the Indian Ocean region by Arab and African sailors. We also have increased knowledge of wind and ocean currents in the Atlantic Ocean. Europeans are starting to master the wind patterns, the ocean currents in the Atlantic, in the same way that sailors in the Indian Ocean region had been learning and understanding the monsoon winds for thousands of years. Now there was greater understanding, especially off the coast of northern Africa. There were a few islands out here that the Europeans were studying the wind and ocean patterns, and that ultimately would drive them to voyage deeper into the Atlantic. Europeans were also increasingly using the stars, developing astronomical charts. They're no longer just using the stars to engage in superstitious astrology, but instead beginning to think in similar ways to other groups which had been using the stars for navigational purposes. Europeans were also developing some more advanced ship designs. We have the Caravel, which was a ship developed first by the Portuguese, later sailed by the Spanish. It's a small, highly maneuverable ship. Therefore, it's very good for doing some exploration. Columbus had 2 of these caravels on his voyages. They're very small, they're very maneuverable, and therefore they are very good for the type of voyaging that Europeans were doing. The Europeans also developed a larger trade ship called the Carrack. You can see the Carrack here. Once you've established those trade connections, you need a ship to be able to carry larger amounts of goods, and so the Carrack served that purpose. So 2 important ships developed by European states, including the Spanish and the Portuguese, that were useful in this age of exploration. The Europeans also developed a better understanding of cartography. Cartography is the science of map making. Here we see a European map from the Middle Ages. This is called the T&O map. You can see we've got Asia here, we've got Europe, we've got Africa, and you say, wait a second, this thing seems sideways. That's because the way they used to orient the maps was they used to put the east on the top. So these were the Middle Age T&O maps. This obviously a little bit more accurate. You see the Mediterranean Sea here between Europe and Africa and Asia. Here we see a map from around the same time period. This was developed in the Islamic world. We can see Europe here, the Middle East, Asia, Africa. So we can certainly see by 1154, the Islamic scholars were starting to engage in this more in-depth, detailed cartography or map making. Here we see a Venetian map. So this is in 1450, and you see this thing looks all kind of weird, but then when you turn it around, it actually looks pretty accurate. So you can see Europe is very accurate. Africa here is a bit of a mess. The Middle East, again, a little bit more messy, in Asia. So you get a better sense of how Europeans sort of understood Afro-Eurasia in this period of 1450. In addition to improved maritime and navigational technology, there were a number of other factors that caused lasting and sustained contact starting in 1492 between the hemispheres. A second factor, European demand for Asian goods was especially high in this period. So there was an increased desire amongst Europeans to get their hands on some of the spices of South and Southeast Asia, or some of the products coming out of East Asia. The opposite certainly wasn't necessarily the case. There was less interest, for instance, in the Chinese trying to make their way to Europe to get access to some of the less desirable European goods like wool. The Portuguese had also demonstrated the feasibility of long-range oceanic navigation along the west coast of Africa. Remember, it's the Portuguese that developed that school of navigation and then send out their first ships, starting to develop some trade connections and contacts on that west coast of Africa. In the year 1488, the Portuguese make it to the southern tip of Africa and definitively determined that there was a way into the Indian Ocean region by way of the Atlantic Ocean. A fourth factor, Spain. Spain, who becomes a major player in oceanic navigation, they are increasing in unity and wealth. There is a marriage that takes place that leads to greater unity in Spain between these 2 states, Castile and Aragon. In the year 1492, the Spanish complete an expulsion of Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. So remember, the Umayyad Caliphate, the religion of Islam, had spread into the region starting around 700 CE, and there was a Reconquista, the attempt to reconquer that land by Christians. It also led to the Spanish issuing edicts to expel Jews as well. Many of those Jews ended up leaving the Iberian Peninsula and ended up settling in the Ottoman Empire. So the next question, why Western Europe? Why not some of the other competitors who had far more advanced technologies than Europe would have had at the time? Why not Asia? Why not the Islamic world? Well, there's a couple of important factors to keep in mind here. For one thing, it's the sheer geographic distinctions between Europe and Asia. So the Atlantic Ocean is only about 3,000 miles wide versus the Pacific Ocean, from where China is located, for instance, to the Americas is about 6,000 miles. So Western Europe is simply geographically closer to the Americas than the Asian competitors. Second, there was greater competition in Europe. Since the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe was never able to really ever reunify, but instead formed smaller decentralized states, and there was a lot of competition. For instance, as we saw, between the Spanish and Portuguese. So the Portuguese make it to the Indian Ocean region. They seem destined to establish trade connections with South and Southeast Asia, and that prompts Spain to then send out their own exploration voyages with Christopher Columbus. A third factor: the Europeans were increasingly looking for land and resources suitable for the cultivation of cash crops. By the time we get to 1400, we're starting to see sugar increasingly is a product that is demanded in Europe, but sugar is not suitable to grow in the European climate. And so there's increasing desire to find land where sugar is suitable, and there's lots of that in the Caribbean and in South America and places like Brazil. And then finally, the motivation of religion. So Christianity is a more missionary religion, generally speaking. And if you read some of the writings from this period, it really speaks to this idea that, especially once the Europeans had established contact with the people of the Americas, the desire to convert many of those people to Christianity was certainly high up on the list. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, why did European states sponsor exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries? And second, why 1492 and why Western Europe? As always, thanks for watching.